Mercy Otis Warren is one of the early historians of the American Revolution, writes one of the Whig accounts of the rebellion, of course, that celebrates the fact that this was a glorious movement towards independence and personal liberty. Again, very patriotic type of account that was absolutely necessary, people thought, in the aftermath of the success against the British. She called in some of her plays, she actually wrote a play about loyalists, and it was called The Blockheads. Gives you an idea what she thought about them. And in her farce about the American Revolution, in her actual play, 3 of the loyalists were called, Simple, Surly, and Meager. Those were their characters' names, which tells you a little bit about what she thinks of them. So she creates a caricature of the loyalists, and a lot of people abided by that caricature, not to take them very seriously or to take their concerns or the reasons why they actually stayed loyal to Great Britain seriously. Many loyalists are conservative. They don't want to see the social and economic order turn complete upheaval. They also favor continuing ties to England in the 1770s. I think some of them also sympathize with the ideas of the rebellion, but never saw an end game where you completely cut ties with the parent country. So again, even someone like Thomas Hutchinson can say, look, I'm not sure if Parliament even has the authority to tax internally the colonies, but it doesn't matter. I mean, that's what's going to happen. That's the decision that's made from Parliament, and we're going to abide by it. But we also know that the animosities between the two sides can run everything from, again, simple envy, confusion, resentment, to outright hatred of the patriots. And it was an opportunity during this unsettling time of the American Revolution to, of course, settle old scores with neighbors. The American Revolution is a civil war. Histories of the South really like to mention that, but it is a civil war in all parts of North America. It gets particularly nasty in the South, as we're going to find out in 1780 and 1781. So how did the rebellion deal with those who don't want to join the popular movement? And how did that dealing with them shift from, okay, we're now beginning to organize a concentrated resistance, the insurgency in 1774 and 1775. So they had the tactics by which they could monitor those who were loyal to Great Britain already established in the 1770s. Again, if you did not participate in a non-importation agreement, you were going to face sanctions against you, intimidation, threats against your property, against your person, houses dismantled. We saw everything, tarring and feathering. There was intimidation, of course, that was used. You could be blacklisted. You could have your name printed in the newspaper, everything that could be done to single you out. There was violence against property, although not a lot of personal violence against individuals. Yes, tarring and feathering happened, but just not on the scale of massive murder and retribution. Not on a massive scale. It did happen. And it happened a lot in the South after 1780. We're going to go back and revisit the 1780 campaign because it seems chaotic. And the leadership of the Continental Army and Congress realizes we need to establish some kind of order there. We can't leave the resistance to the British in the South simply to these so-called partisan groups. Those we mentioned last time. Again, the militia commanders in different capacities throughout the Carolinas and Georgia. So what happens after 1776 and independence? So you have a method by which you can keep an eye and observe these folks who remain loyal, hoping, of course, that most of them leave, and tens of thousands of them leave the American colonies after 1776. So the government of the different states no longer colonies, make it their mission to keep an eye on those who have questionable loyalty. And that's one of their charges during the American Rebellion. To give you an idea of how many served maybe in different capacities, There's never enough loyalists to undo the revolution. In any state, there are strengths and pockets of loyalism. 20 to 25% of the American colonists were loyal. Again, we may have heard, and you may have come across that John Adams, 1/3 of those were for the revolution, 1/3 against, one didn't care, but he was actually talking about the French Revolution when I don't know how it got applied to the American Revolution, but 20, a fifth to a quarter, in other words, of Americans remained loyal. There are concentrations of loyalism in certain geographic parts of North America, upstate New York, and New York City as well. That's why the British decided they would stay and remain really for most of the war in New York, make it their base of operations. And it always was the goal of Washington to recapture New York once he had lost it. Areas of Georgia, probably because it was the last established colony and that the British did have a small military presence there. That's why they couldn't send early on delegates to the Continental Congress. That's why some of the laws that were broken down up and down the Atlantic seaboard were not in Georgia. There was a strong community of North Carolina Highlanders, again, separate from the lowland Scots, the Highlanders in the northern area, that remained loyal to Great Britain. They had probably arrived to the American colonies within the last generation. So there's no rule that says if you're in the colonies longer, you're going to be a loyalist or you're going to be, again, part of the revolutionary movement. Again, there's examples of both. New arrivals were strongly loyal to Great Britain, and those who thought they had a lot to lose remained loyal as well. Though they are not formidable by themselves, when loyalists combine, they could always help in British arms, even if it didn't mean joining a militia, Tory or loyalist militia unit. You can also have loyalists work in many capacities, not necessarily military capacities. They would serve as guides for British officers who knew the land better than anyone else, whether they be someone in Massachusetts, helping General Gates negotiate the roads around Boston, or they be someone else, such as a black man in South Carolina who tells, among other British officers, the way to get around or through American lines, to have a point of attack, or to show that Washington has left part of his flank in New York unguarded. Take this road, turn left, and you'll turn the whole American side of their defensive lines around, which, as we know, did happen. So you can supply intelligence if you are a loyalist and a non-combatant. Certainly you can give aid to British officers, and you can give food and supplies throughout the conflict. As many as 50,000, we estimate, served in some capacity as a military force. Now that could be in the Army, that could be in a militia unit, the Navy. The South aggressively tried to recruit loyalists in the South in 1779 in their so-called Southern Campaign, with the expectation that there was a strong loyalist population, maybe greater than the 20 or 25%. They probably didn't have accurate numbers, but they suspected that maybe it had to do with the fact that we're talking about the more wealthy sections of North America. If there was a chance that the revolution succeeded, the system of slavery would come undone. They have a lot of land, and their religion, their faith might have kept them loyal to Great Britain. Again, loyal not only to the government of England, but loyal to the Anglican Church, the official church in basically every southern colony. So that gave them, at least the English, this pipe dream that they could, again, this other arm of the British military might in the form of loyalist regiments. They had some success, but not as much as probably they would have hoped for. Because many colonies have experienced harassing Crown officials prior to 1776, the question is, how do they turn that to watching and suppressing Tories after 1776? It starts right away. Early in 1776, even before independence, Congress tells the states, control and watch the loyalists. Keep a check on these people. This is surveillance. It's not, again, what we always like to glorify with the so-called patriotic efforts of Americans of the past. So states prevented loyalists, people who wanted to remain with Great Britain, from speaking or writing against the American Revolution. This was now seen as treasonous behavior. So treasonous people saying that treason is speaking out against the treasonous government. I know it seems crazy, but that's what was happening. They also punished those who did write and speak. So controlling speech was part of how you kept the loyalists in check. The following year in 1777, Congress essentially told the states, we're giving you authorization to seize private property. Why? Revenue. You can take it, you can sell it to Congress. And especially what you wanted to target first is loyalists who left. That was easy. This house is abandoned, the people are gone, their furniture, sell the house. What about someone who's left and their family is there? Well, sell the house and give some of the sales to the surviving family members. 1/3, I think the general rule was. That way the wife and kids weren't completely and totally destitute. So the responsibility of monitoring and keeping track of loyalists was left to the different committees of safety, who had been born from the First Continental Congress and the so-called association, the Continental Association, that its enforcement arm of non-importation and finally non-exportation then follows with the committees of safety. They were supposed to enforce the law. You look for seditious speech. Who wrote that newspaper column? Find out who it is. I mean, if you're smart, you write it in an anonymous manner. If you're not smart, you put your name on it, and then the committee of safety will no doubt pay you a visit. You also had to keep track of tax evaders. Your taxes were now being paid in the state to support the rebellion because the royal governments had completely come undone by 1775 and 1776. Watch who serves in the militia and watch who does not. Why aren't you answering the militia call? We need a quota for this particular state to go to the Continental Army or to serve 90 days in the militia because there is a military emergency in fill in the blank state. Maryland, New Jersey, South Carolina, Virginia. That was another responsibility of these committees of safety. Most states required an oath of allegiance to the revolutionary government. It made those who were wavering, of course, and with their support, take it. A lot did. A lot of people took the oath saying, look, maybe I'll be left alone if I take the oath of allegiance, and then just skulk back and not participate in the conflict, which for the most part is the best you can hope for if you are, of course, on the side of the rebellion. The British obviously would want to recruit people who were sitting on the sidelines. The more stout and stubborn Tories refused to take the oath. They were fined. They were stripped of their citizenship. They were denied the right to vote by not taking the loyalty oath. This was suppression of the resistance, and the resistance is loyalism after 1776. So the point I'm making is that they already had the mechanisms in place by which they shifted from, okay, resistance, now independence, how do we control the loyalist population among us? Those who take a commission from the British in a loyalist regiment are seen as traitors to the cause. They can be, in the best case scenario, imprisoned or possibly banished from the state. Excommunicated, in other words. Thousands refuse to take the oath. Thousands do not sit out the war, and they leave for England or for Canada and the West Indies. 50,000, maybe more. Could have been as high as 100,000. The revolution split whole regions of people, whole Anglican congregations, whether they be in areas of the South or even in New England. The Dutch were split in New York. More conservative elements of the Dutch there, the English-speaking, support the rebellion. The more conservative Dutch support the king. The Quakers in Pennsylvania try to sit the war out, as do the Moravians in South Carolina and North Carolina. but even that seems suspicious. This looks like favoring the British if you don't help, if you simply have against your conscience to not take one side. So the Quakers have to endure that in the aftermath. Well, you didn't help, what's your role in all of this if you didn't participate in the revolution? Well, they're pacifists. So they sit on the sidelines. For a lot of people, that just isn't enough. And so it makes people say, oh, we have to track these folks as well. Okay, that's what we didn't get to last time. We're going to talk about today the continuation of the war in the South, and of course, Benedict Arnold's treason over West Point. Let's pull up the notes here if we can. In 1779, the American economy was in bad shape, deep trouble. The initial 18 months of the war, there had been a boom of prices and wages going up. 18 months, a year and a half. Those days were over. The war stimulated domestic manufacturing. If we don't have to buy it from England or can't, because the Crown has essentially shut down trade, we'll buy it here, what we produce on our own. Buying and wearing American was a patriotic thing to do, even if it meant wearing scratchy, low-quality clothing that you made on your own or mended your clothing. The states, to try to deal with the economic downturn, so that lasted a year and a half, wages up, American products being purchased, everyone seemed to be happy until the states started putting millions and millions of dollars in circulation, printing their own money. There is no national currency. Congress would print their own money as well, but the state money was usually only good within the state. And you can do that, Congress printing money, doubling the amount that the states, when everything is humming along very well in that initial aftermath of independence. But if you print all that money, it's bound to depreciate after a while. And it depreciated quickly after the retreat across New York in 1776. That's the beginning of the economic struggles for the American colonies during the Revolution. The conflict lasts longer than anyone expected, and the governments can't raise enough to finance it. We talked a little bit about the Articles of Confederation, the fact that they ask states for revenue, and the states can't always, of course, meet these quotas. The states in Congress issued more money, and of course, they're unable to back up that money. And you have money, it has the full faith and credit of the U.S. Congress and the national government, but if it's not worth the money it's even, or the paper it's printed on, that's going to have deep ramifications. So what the states then start to do is sell certificates and bonds. Basically, you as a citizen can buy this promissory note that in the future you actually will get it paid back with interest. That's what you hope. The certificate sold in the 1770s. I mention that now because it's part of Hamilton's controversial plan when he becomes the first Secretary of Treasury. Buy back those bonds. Give the people face value for them. So they do that in every war. There are war bond drives in World War I and World War II. This was no different. So this is just another revenue measure. They're hoping it's going to slow down printing money, and printing money is fun, the states find out. Their printing presses can't crank out money quickly enough. But inflation goes up, and you devalue the currency if you have so much out there and you can't back it up. So what takes place next? Let's sell certificates and bonds. Maybe that will offset the cost of the war. Congress does the same thing. And so Congress also helps if we're going to try to control inflation. We'll put in place wages and price controls. These are always controversial. Wages can't go up. They have to, again, kind of reach. And also prices for certain items. There should be an agreed upon price. They worked for a short time. But a lot of people were exporting or selling to the British the essentials that the army and the people needed. We're going to kind of talk a little bit more about that, and Washington has firsthand experience of that when he travels to see Congress. Eventually, by the middle of the war, the Congress just turns over raising money to the states on their own, raising the money and paying the army. And if you have to find whatever measure you can, Congress tells the states, and this ties in directly to what we've been talking about before, because the states begin to sell loyalist property, which is great at first, and then land values begin to go in the tank. So you're just getting pennies on the dollar. It sounds great, the way to raise money, promissory currency, but there's, of course, a reckoning for all that by 1778 and into 1779, when taxes are 100 times what they had been in peacetime. They need to be that high to sustain the rebellion. People are noticing, and the Tories are having a field day with this. These are the taxes that you didn't like to pay when taxes didn't exist under the British system. Now your state internal taxes, the ones that the English couldn't raise with the Stamp Act, now you're going to pay much more than you ever dreamed of in the British system. Well, it was necessary because the war lasted longer than I think a lot of people thought it would. So if you start seizing Tory land, you can sell it, raise some of the revenue, but the currency value begins to depreciate very rapidly. Property sells for, by 1778, we have this statistic, about a quarter of what it had been at the start of the war. So you're getting 25% of what the land had been worth just a couple years before, and there's no end in sight because it doesn't look like the war is going to end anytime soon. By the end of 1779, the value of the continental currency is 3 cents on the dollar. Yikes. Wheat and salt prices soar. This is inflation, meaning it costs more money to get a given item in 1776 and then in 1779. Both wheat and salt get 40 times in 1779 what they were worth in 1777. A hat can cost as much as $400. The price of a horse, not a house. House prices probably go up too, but the price of a horse, one statistic I have, is 20 times what it had been at the start of the rebellion. This can be directly connected with hurting the army. You need horses for cavalry and scouting. The quartermaster department that year spends $100 million and gets $10 million worth of goods. There's inflation. Washington lets fly about this situation. How can you wage a war when he says a wagon load of money will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provisions? Good question. In December of 1778, with the Continental Army scattered in encampments in New York and New Jersey, Washington travels to Pennsylvania. He leaves the army and goes to find Congress. Now, just to set this in perspective, the English had left Philadelphia that summer. Washington had hit the British moving across New Jersey at the Battle of Monmouth, and the British are once again warmly ensconced in New York City. And Congress has retaken up residence in Philadelphia. Congress wants to know about Washington's war plans in the upcoming campaign, and Washington eagerly travels to talk to Congress. Be good to get away from the army a little bit and some of the mundane tasks and the somewhat depressing situation of yet another encampment that's going to lead to another year of the war. It's going to drag on further, which he in many ways understands it has to be this way. But he's fighting this kind of idea. We got to drag it out to keep the British from losing interest. But at the same time, will France endure a couple more years? Because the French are grousing already about the lack of coordination between Washington and the French. The situation in the South doesn't look very promising either. Washington hadn't been away from the army in years, and he spends 43 days in Philadelphia, trying to see and get the plans developed, talk to members of Congress, see what challenges there will be in the next year. And what Washington sees in his 40-odd day visit to Philadelphia gives him greater alarm than anything he had seen since the dark days of 1776. And it begins to change his perspective about the good citizens of the United States and about the Congress as well. He's not happy about his trip. Night after night, he is the guest of affluent Philadelphians who live in comfort. The war is kind of out of their minds, out of sight, out of mind. The British had occupied, yes, Philadelphia the year before, but they're gone. Tables that he goes to eat at, groan under food and drink. The talk was about how you can possibly enrich yourself during the war. Washington is shocked. He doesn't understand why anyone can think about profits when his army is up in not fantastic conditions in the encampments in New Jersey and New York. Common soldiers face cold, disease, starvation. Officers are quitting the service in droves. I can't get paid. I can't get back pay. We'll see that frustration manifest itself in one Benedict Arnold. The merchant class in the Quaker City attend balls, theaters, host lavish parties. The thirst for riches abound during the war. Washington simply can't comprehend it. War is part of their plan, they say, to get wealthier. And he suspects that this is the case in many of the American major cities. A few days there in the city convinced him that the American Revolution, he says, is, quote, in imminent danger. Unless things were brought back to first principles, he says, the inevitable ruin must follow. Where, in summary, he asks, is the sacrifice? He doesn't see it. War is out of sight and out of mind for the people of Philadelphia. Then it got worse. He went to Congress itself and started to talk to congressmen. None of the colleagues that he had known in 1774 and 1775 were around. They weren't in Congress anymore. We mentioned that Congress term limits a lot of folks. That was part of the reason. Adams and Franklin, they're serving overseas. Others, like Jefferson, returned to their respective state. Probably they'd spent some time in Congress and said, okay, independence achieved, now return and go back to Virginia in the case of Jefferson, who actually gets elected governor. Jefferson's a wartime governor, not very successful. It will be one of the, let's just say, not celebratory parts of his professional political career, because the war comes to Virginia and he doesn't accord himself very well as Thomas Jefferson. Some were just forsaking public service and staying home. The first-rate characters were sleeping at home, and Washington said, ruin is now upon us. That's why I asked that question, where are all of our great men? Nothing against the people who were serving in Congress, but the first-rate representatives who had engineered independence are no longer in Congress. General Washington, with all due respect, doesn't have a lot of comprehension of the economics of the time. That's the problem, not necessarily the leadership. The other issue that he's becoming very, very aware of is that Congress may not be adequate as it is constituted, the power of the government to deal with the circumstances, the lack of government, the decentralized political system of the Articles of Confederation really is at the root of all evil. I mean, that's the conclusion a lot of people will come to at the end of this American rebellion. We won, got our independence in spite of and not because of the central government and the actions of Congress. If the current state were to continue, Washington concludes, America is going to be a second-rate power and would also lose the war. Don't worry about what's going to happen in the aftermath. We're not going to get through it. So it begins to build this idea. And Washington isn't alone. You know, the officers are frustrated. They haven't been paid. Obviously, the soldiers in the ranks are freezing. They're better provided for with uniforms and blankets, not necessarily always better fed. And the difference maker there would be, of course, the French alliance, which sends more supplies, and they reach the American Army encampments in 1778, the year after Valley Forge, the first full year of the treaty. So Washington left Philadelphia, returned back to the encampment in New York, hoping that men of abilities would save the country. But he didn't, to his everlasting credit, criticize openly the Articles of Confederation. Again, not openly. I'm sure he had conversations with people among his military family. That would be his inside group of officers that he talked to. He also realized, leaving Congress, leaving Philadelphia, that the war was far from over. And he's concerned that the English have to understand the American state of the economy. Now, the English are the ones who have to give up because they just don't want to sustain this effort anymore. But when the English know how bad things are in the colonies, at least for the army, and the fact that the good, loyal citizens aren't exactly loyal to the patriot cause, aren't doing their fair share. When that information gets back to England, the English are going to be emboldened and say, let's drag it out so they quit. Washington's strategy is, let's drag it out on this side so the British quit. That's what he's worried about. The perception overseas. At least Jefferson got the message. He stayed away from Congress and served as governor of Virginia. That satisfied Washington to some degree, at least. So 1779 had not been the best year for the American cause. There hadn't been really military disasters, but there had been also no progress toward winning the war. That's why we say 1780 is going to be in some ways a critical year. In the South, there had been a failure to recapture Savannah. American efforts there, undone. The war seemed to be never ending. Washington thought, well, time is going to be on our side, but even he was beginning to wonder if time was on the side of the cause. Will the nation make it? And that visit to Philadelphia and seeing Congress really cast some doubts in his mind. And that's tied directly to, we've been unable to coordinate any kind of Navy with the French Army with the Continental Army, and retake New York. He seems to be obsessed about retaking New York. And I think the French are telling him, and some of his own officers, it just can't happen. I mean, they're dug in there. It's an armed island, and you're going to get basically Bunker Hill in reverse. But it's always forward in Washington's mind. So 1780 appeared to be the crucial year, and as we find out, it's going to be, at least through a good part of it, a very, very bad year. The Army was now encamped in Morristown, New Jersey again. It had been in site of an earlier encampment, the 1776-1777 encampment. Everyone likes to talk about, and the mythology about the American Revolution is Valley Forge, the bloody footprints in the snow, the soldiers who have tatters and rags and just limp into camp. But Morristown, weather-wise, was a lot worse. It started to snow in December 1779. It snowed every day throughout most of that month, and every 3 to 4 days throughout the winter. In January, there was a blizzard in Morristown, New Jersey that lasted 36 hours. That sounds horrible. The snow drifts by that time were already 12 feet in some spots. So, Valley Forge, bad supplies, not bad weather. Morristown, very bad weather. Snowdrifts didn't melt till May, but a slightly better supply system. The Army was still lacking food, but the uniforms at least were getting better. And now we'll turn back to what's happening in the American South. We'll pick up the story after the surrender of Charleston, which was in May 1780. The efforts of General Clinton, the British general in the South, had been so overwhelming, capturing Savannah, repelling the attack, and then capturing upwards of 6,000 soldiers stuck in Charleston in May 1780, that he returned to New York and left the command of the South, pacifying all the Carolinas, to a fairly aggressive commander, Charles Cornwallis. Congress hears about the situation with the entire Continental Army had surrendered, and all that's left there effectively are these little partisan bands, the individuals we talked about last time. That would be Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens. Militia groups, the partisan war of 1780 begins. Now that's fine, and you can definitely become an annoyance to the British Army, but you need a full-scale presence of soldiers there. The news got worse. I mentioned what happened. Let me show you, because this gets back to um, a little something we talked about last time. I think he's here. Yeah, this is Bannister Tarleton. You know, there was a group of, again, this is the story from last time. I'll just repeat it briefly. A group of Virginia Continentals who were coming to the aid of the encampment and the siege of Charleston. They got there too late. They heard about the surrender and they said, okay, we'll go back and make our way to Virginia. And Tarleton heard about these soldiers who were trying to make their way, several hundred these are Continental Army soldiers. And his group, known as the Tory Legion. Now, he's a member of Parliament. He had a very wealthy background. He had been an aggressive cavalry commander. Well, he recruited what was called the Tory Legion. So he's a British officer in charge of British soldiers, but a lot of them are Americans who wore the green jacket to symbolize, again, this particular uniform. And he was very flashy and very, of course, bold in his attack strategy. And these soldiers saw this group of cavalry towards them, the American Continentals. And many of them tried to fire a shot off, but they were overwhelmed so quickly by the Tory Legion, and most of them tried to surrender. They would yell quarter and they would throw down their guns, and a lot of them were killed in the aftermath anyway. Didn't show the quarter or mercy. I mean, you know, you're on bended knee, you say, I'm not going to fight anymore, throw your gun, and the Tory Legion butchered a lot of them and attempted to surrender. And that was Carolina in 1780. Everyone knows there has to be a presence of a Continental Army. Let's go back and look at the part. I think I'm going to use another slideshow here. Let's see. Oh, that's the one I want. Okay. I'm not sure y'all can see that on Teams. Let me make sure it's, there we go. Okay. So we're talking about this area right here. South Carolina, Charleston, May 1780. This is where the surrender takes place. Cornwallis is in charge. Here's Cornwallis. He's going to lead the attack into the interior, pacify the Carolinas, and then move your way up into Virginia. That's the British strategy outlined in 1778. They're going to put Tories and Loyalists in place in new colonial governments that will be loyal to Great Britain. They'll make their way to Virginia, and maybe the Southern colonies will just say, you know what, we're out of it. We're knocked out of the fighting, and we'll sue for some kind of separate peace. Maybe the representatives in Congress will sue for a separate peace with Great Britain. It is Congress who typically appoints commanders in the South. Washington had his own preference, but he, to his everlasting credit, deferred to Congress, who's going to be in charge when we send and organize the units scattered in the Carolinas. Who's going to be in charge of it? Congress chooses Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga, 1777. He has a sterling reputation in Congress. Some people were thought in Congress, Washington's fortunes were down in 1777. Gates were up. Maybe we ought to switch commanders. And Gates, of course, fueled that conspiracy, or whatever you want to call it, that happened in Congress. Gates lobbied shamelessly for the command of the Southern Army after the surrender of Charleston. When he gets to the area, he takes stock of what's there in eastern North Carolina. He takes command in Hillsborough. He's got a corps of some Continental soldiers, experienced veterans. He's got some militia gathered from the different states, but the army was very short of supplies. It's a different situation that he is in charge of in the Northern Army in New York in 1777. It's not a strong an army. There are no horses. They are eating green vegetables, green corn, from unhappy neighbors in eastern North Carolina. He also lacks something that every commander of an army needs, which is good intelligence. He's a stranger here in North Carolina. He assesses the situation and decides that he's going to go on the attack. He doesn't know the strength of his own army. He doesn't know the strength of the British army. He probably should have just done nothing. assess the military situation, see where Cornwallis was going to deploy in South Carolina, train your militia, get them ready, and move in and fight in a way that gives you the advantage. But in Gates's mind, he outnumbers Cornwallis, and he's actually on equal terms because Cornwallis gets reinforcements from Charleston. They have a lot more cavalry, including Banastre Tarleton's Tory Legion. Gates doesn't have the ability to scout the terrain and a place to fight and to see the strength of Gates's army. But he doesn't want to retreat. He thinks that's absolutely unthinkable. So he moves his army out of North Carolina towards central South Carolina. It's right here marked on the map. It is Camden. It is not far from present-day Columbia, South Carolina. That's where Gates is. His soldiers around him, his officers say, look, the British Army is as strong, if not stronger than we are. We are in no position to fight. The army is hungry. He's like, no, we've got plenty of soldiers for what we need done. It gives the army the morning of the battle, which is August 1780, a breakfast of mush and molasses. The army quickly said, oh, this tastes great, and then realized that that combination would give you horrible and violent, let's just say, intestinal issues. Yeah, and you're in no condition to fight. The army is weakened. The ensuing battle, the Battle of Camden, August of 1780, was a complete and unmitigated disaster. How in the world did Horatio Gates arrange his army with the weakest part of the army, the militia, facing the best part of the British Army? He had been a veteran of the British Army. What was he doing? So he takes the militia to face off on one side of his army to the strongest part of the British Army. And you can pretty much guess what happens next.
Was it something with that meal that caused that, or was it just a known fact?
It was a known fact. What the British would typically do is line up some of their weaker wing of their soldiers on the left side.
No, I mean with the food.
Oh yeah. That put. I mean, what kind of mettle would you have when you were dehydrated? Going out in the woods a lot. Yeah. And it's August in South Carolina. Yeah. Yes. No. It just took an army that was weakened to fortify them. You know, you would eat it because you were hungry, and it felt great to get something in your stomach. And then, you know, the inevitable would happen. You say, oh, this isn't good. And you'd run off. And I mean, if you had the army in that condition, you're not going to be able to slug it out with the British, who are much better provisioned and fed. And then, you know, his officers told him, look, the militia is not going to stand and fight. And he thought, nah, they did well with me in New York 3 years ago. This wasn't the same militia force. And so the British unleashed their army at this battle. The militia run. Some of them fire a shot. Others just say, guns going this way, I'm going the other way. And that leaves the Continentals, the experienced veteran soldiers, to basically, who still stay in the battle, fight against these overwhelming odds until they actually flee the field as well. Gates got on the fastest horse, apparently, that was in the Carolinas in 1780, because he takes off to try to rally the soldiers. And then when he sees they're in full-fledged retreat, he runs on his horse. He gallops way ahead of the retreating soldiers and doesn't stop until he gets to Charlotte, North Carolina, 60 miles away. When they ask him later, you know, why did you just keep, you know, bolting from the field there on your steady steed of a horse? He said, I'm scouting a new area for the encampment. And everyone's like, okay. And Washington, I'm sure privately, never would admit it, but loved this turnout. Gates had his comeuppance here. All the laurels he had as the brilliant commander of the Saratoga campaign, completely undone because of the Battle of Camden, August 1780. For the second time in 90 days, and the fourth time in 18 months, a Southern army had suffered a defeat. This is why 1780 looks really bleak when we look at and encapsulate the entire American rebellion. Gates, it turns out, is replaced. He's finally replaced because of his incompetence there. There's a military tribunal. He basically escapes. He should have been on the spot, but that didn't happen. Instead, Congress goes and asks, this time Washington. They ask him, who do you want to be in charge? And he chooses this man, Nathaniel Greene. This is who he wanted in the first place. Nickname, the Fighting Quaker. Well, he wasn't a Quaker because Quakers are pacifists. He was written out of the Society of Friends upon joining his Rhode Island regiment as basically a private and working his way up. He was trusted by George Washington. Washington made it clear to members of Congress and those around him, if anything happens to me, this guy's in charge. Basically, he'd be the next commander of the Continental Army. Greene was a stickler for details and logistics. He had rescued the quartermaster department at the Valley Forge encampment in 1778. He's an exponent of what I call the Fabian strategy, that idea that you don't fight in a situation where your army will be absolutely annihilated. And he is more important than anything else, according to Washington, tactful. He can write the governors of the southern states and say, this is what I need, what I would like you to provide, without being gruff, without the military jargon of, hey, governors, jump, this is how high. Washington understands that, and this is what he needs in the South. What Greene sees when he gets down there would just absolutely frighten anybody. Okay. The two men meet in October of 1780 after news of the defeat. No one takes any notes, or there's no record of the conversation. That's another one of those, love to have seen what these two talked about. I'm sure it's Washington saying, you know the way we're fighting now up here? Do that in the South. And Greene saying, I understand completely. You know, this has to be turned around. You have to coordinate disparate elements of the partisan war that is still going on, thankfully. There's a resistance in the Carolinas, but we need the steadying force of a Continental Army and an officer. So he's not only going to have to talk to the governors in the different states, massage Thomas Jefferson to say, look, take the soldiers out, the militia out of your state and send them to me and the army. He's got to talk to Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, and say, and he does. So I've read Greene's letters. Look, out there alone, you can do some things, I understand that. But together, rally to the army, or what's left of the army after Camden, they're essentially annihilated, and then we could do more damage, a coordinated attack and a resistance to Cornwallis. When Greene arrives, the situation isn't very good, of course, militarily. There were a couple hundred soldiers left, no money, and not really any supplies. And Greene, like Washington, just has to sometimes rely on unique methods. He goes on the attack. He becomes aggressive in the Carolinas. An upcountry area of South Carolina, here it is. There we have, of course, the Charleston district. The Camden district right here is where the Battle of Camden took place. So what Cornwallis wants to do is just fan out into South Carolina, the upstate. This is called the upstate, northwestern North Carolina. This is where Clemson University is. John Calhoun's family will settle there. The Waxhaw district is in this region in between North and South Carolina. That's where Andrew Jackson was born in the 1760s. So it seemed on the surface that the surrender of Charleston, followed by the Battle of Camden, would pacify the Carolina countryside. The upcountry, the low country was in that condition, the areas around the coast in Charleston. But the upcountry, which was seemingly indifferent to the surrender of Charleston, begins to stir in the second half of 1780, just in time for Greene to arrive in October. It's a lot like the backcountry of Massachusetts in 1774 and 1775, after the Boston Tea Party and the time of the Intolerable Acts. No one factor determines why people support the rebellion in South Carolina. Some do it because their home is invaded. Others do it because they know this is it. This is the time to save the revolution. Maybe they want to reorder their own world and change things dramatically, economically, politically. Maybe they want to escape the domination Charleston has in the politics of the whole state. Remember, this is an area that had been very much chastened by the regulator movement in the 1760s. Others are Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who simply hate the British and Anglicans and the leadership of the colony, which was mostly Anglican in the days before independence. We can only speculate. Many are detached from the revolution. Many stay out. Many are neutral until they are assailed by Tories or there are threats made to free slaves, even if they're not slave owners, if you're a race war. Others are simply pushed to support the rebellion because of the ruthlessness of the enemy, the ruthlessness of Cornwallis. It starts in the new acquisition district, right here, area that borders North Carolina, near the Waxhaws in Camden. The militia rise up after Camden. You think they'd be devastated, destroyed, but that wasn't exactly the case. The British Legion, Tarleton, of course, gets a lot of people to support the rebellion. There's murdering and pillaging, not on a massive scale, but enough, of course, to push people to take sides. The Tory Legion takes 90 slaves in 1780. They burn those who are known to be associated with the militia, and the Patriot militia swells. They strike back, triggering an unending cycle of violence in 1780 and 1781, a civil war within an American Revolution. Maybe to a degree unknown in any other section of the United States, it is pitiless savagery. Battles we don't even probably know about. I mean, small pockets of forces just fighting each other. People who had been neighbors, one is a militia unit attached to the Tories, another is a group of neighbors who just fight because they didn't like each other beforehand. Now they have a reason to, up the ante from we don't like you to, we're going to now kill you. Nathaniel Greene claimed one day that there was nothing left of the area. He was traveling into South Carolina from North Carolina and said the whole country is in danger of being laid waste by the Whigs and Tories who pursue each other with as much relentless fury as beasts of prey, unquote. Bands of rebel guerrilla fighters form in the summer of 1780, mounted troops. That's the situation he walks into. They appear from nowhere and strike small detachments of British parties, and then they disappear into the forests and the swamps. That's what you get with Francis. Andrew Pickens commands militia in the state with both Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter. They divide the areas into the east and west. Again, there's no Continental Army. It had been essentially scattered. The remnants ran along with Horatio Gates. So South Carolina, this is what happens. This is the partisan war. Cornwallis noticed it because his soldiers are being picked off a few at a time. His little army is down to about 1,000 soldiers. It's very difficult to conduct offensive operations when you've only got that many troops, and you have to keep the bulk of them back in Charleston to prevent a counterattack by the Continental Army. After the Battle of Camden, 15% of his army is gone. Not a good development as a commander. He thought, no problem, I'm going to recruit Tories in the region. They're not coming out, though. They're not coming out in the numbers that will supplement his small force of British regulars. So he decides to respond with brutality that he never would have subscribed to earlier in his career. They changed tactics. Cavalry units, like those with Banastre Tarleton, search for partisans, destroy homesteads of rebels, hang parole violators. He also decides to send and dissuade anyone in the western areas of the state, the back country, from participating in fighting in the partisan war. This is Patrick Ferguson, a Scottish officer in the British Army. He went west to organize loyalists in the Carolina foothills, the border between North and South Carolina. Cornwallis told him, don't go on the offensive until South Carolina is pacified. Instead, Ferguson interpreted that as go on the offensive and go into North Carolina, which is exactly what he did in the fall of 1780. Ferguson's force meets with disaster. This is a unique situation in the American Revolution. I'll talk briefly about the Battle of Kings Mountain. It's along the North and South Carolina border. It is a national park now. It is fantastic to visit because you can see the situation that Ferguson and his soldiers put themselves in. Ferguson started his campaign in the West by issuing what I can only call in historical terms a nincompoop proclamation, promising fire and sword would be used to lay waste to what are known as the over mountain communities in Virginia, North and South Carolina. The response from those armed over mountain men was, we'll see about that. They corner Ferguson's force. Now, this is why the battle is unique. Everyone here is an American. The only officer from the British Army is Ferguson, in charge of the British soldiers here on top of Kings Mountain. You have to have a kind of a leisurely, nice walk up to the top of this little hill, and that's where the British camp is in October of 1780. It is about 20 miles northwest of Charlotte, just to give you an orientation, in North Carolina. Nevertheless, the rebel militia surround the hill and cut down the Tories who try to fight their way out. This is a unique battle, Americans against Americans, with only Ferguson there in charge as the British officer on the scene. 700 Tories are captured, Americans by fellow Americans at the Battle of Kings Mountain. 320 of these are killed. This is absolutely shuts down the ability of the British to bring more reinforcements in the form of Americans into the fight in the East. Battle of Kings Mountain, October 1780. And of course, it emboldens Nathaniel Greene. He thinks this thing may actually have a shot. I have a core of a couple hundred survivors from the Battle of Camden. Maybe from that, he thinks I'll be able to build an actual army. While Washington was negotiating with the French General Rochambeau about an attack, this is his pipe dream. And the French are like, sure, we'll help. And what about Newport, Rhode Island, or sending them down to Virginia? And Washington is just, I think, fixated on New York. There is a pause in the battle plans. A pause that Washington, of course, would have welcomed. It takes him once again away from the army for a brief time. He has to travel from the encampment in New York up to the French headquarters, which is actually in Hartford, Connecticut. He gets a chance, of course, in this trip up north from New York to Connecticut to visit West Point. West Point is the installation on the Hudson River. Its commander is someone he had a lot of respect for and probably sees something of himself there as well. Benedict Arnold. He liked Arnold. Go ahead.
Oh, but he didn't have respect for him for long.
Exactly. But up to this point, the joke about Arnold is if that bullet had not shattered his leg and killed him at Saratoga, we would have a statue of Benedict Arnold there and not just a statue of his leg on the national battlefield. And he would have been one of the most successful heroes of the American Revolution. Washington liked Arnold. He's fearless and enterprising as a soldier. Washington likes to think that I'm fearless and enterprising as well. He was an imaginative, intrepid when he came to command. This is the guy that builds the fleet that keeps the British from invading New York in 1776, single-handedly delaying the invasion along the Hudson River to the next year, and then, of course, participating in a battle that sees a whole army surrender at Saratoga in October 1777. A musket ball had shattered his leg. He didn't have a field command for over a year. He was out of action and couldn't even ride a horse. So when the British abandoned Philadelphia in the summer of 1778, they leave Philadelphia, go back to New York. What Washington needs is a military commander in charge of the city, and it is Arnold who wants the job. Again, he has a chance to heal, to be ready, hopefully, to take an actual field command the following year. Washington could not have chosen a worse assignment for Benedict Arnold. He makes enemies very quickly in Philadelphia. His habits are expensive. He's just a simple general. Why is he living so high on the hog, they ask. His friendship with those in the city is often a friendship with Tories, which makes him suspect. He actually marries a woman, Peggy Shippen, whose family is, let's just say, of questionable loyalty to the American cause. The city of Philadelphia, during this winter when he is in charge, indicts him on 8 charges of misconduct. There are shady financial dealings. Washington, again, this is linking to what we talked about in the beginning. He's lamenting, as Washington, that the good citizens are getting pretty wealthy and talking about how to get wealthy in a time of this economic disaster, which is the American economy by 1778. And people are asking the question in Philadelphia, how's this guy getting wealthy when, he shouldn't be? Those charges he's eventually cleared of, but they also translate to 8 counts of court-martial. That's more serious for him. That is the military tribunal, which he has to defend himself. He's acquitted on 7 of the 8 counts of the court-martial and lightly reprimanded. And the time that he spends in Philadelphia, within Pennsylvania, leaves him frustrated and bitter over his legal troubles. More importantly, like every officer, it is a stain upon his honor. They had questioned him as a man in charge of Philadelphia, and he didn't appreciate it. And of course, all the other frustrations of Benedict Arnold begin to surface. He's irate about the back pay he thinks he should get. He's also infuriated when Congress promotes those who have been in the Army less time than him and give him a higher rank in general, instead of a major general, instead of a brigadier general. They promoted Benjamin Lincoln, the man who, again, had to surrender Charleston in May 1780. So people who are less worthy have been less time in the Army. And that's really what gets Arnold upset. He also resents the civilians who are never in harm's way, and had leveled those charges against him. All this builds a case that by the summer of 1779, he begins clandestine talks with the British High Command. I get money, I can turn over something very important to you, or sell my services to the British Army. He stayed committed to this idea. You think it might waver on it. All these frustrations manifest themselves into, I'm going to sell out the American cause. But I think what really committed him to doing it and going completely through with it was the surrender of Charleston in 1780, because he begins to ask the question, can we even win? The devastation of that army surrendering in the South, it's like, it might be all over at this point. Maybe this is an opportune time for me to, switch to the winning side, or soon to be winning side. So Arnold is basically told by Washington, you've had a year to coalesce and heal, maybe go out there and we can use you in the field again. Arnold says, no, I'd like to have a command of, maybe something that's important that we have to keep in our overall strategy, and that would be West Point. The West Point fort. Let me show you what that looks like. It's a fort. Now it's, of course, the home of the United States Military Academy. Let's take a look at that. Here we go. There it is, right there on the Hudson River. Again, it protects the British from moving further north along the Hudson, and that would obviously allow them to go into Albany and to, once again, separate New England from the other states. Washington gets command of West Point, and then he gets a promise from the British of 20,000 pounds sterling to turn over the fort, which is in modern, again, these things aren't perfect, in modern money, about $1 million. It should be more, you think? Should have held out for more? Yeah.
You're against this army.
Yeah.
And you're about to give up the best.
Now, we don't know. He could have asked for more. They could have thought it was worth 20,000 pounds sterling. It's a great plan. You're trusted by Washington. Get the fort. Maybe you can even get Washington captured in the process.
He wasn't stupid.
No, even Clinton the general in charge of the British Army, says he's the boldest and most enterprising of the rebel generals. To get him would be fantastic, a real coup to pull him away from the Patriot cause. So Washington wanted Arnold in the field, but he says, I'm still not 100%. I can't ride a horse. I don't feel confident taking command, but I know this West Point job. He asks Washington to be appointed commander of West Point. And then in September of 1780, he hears that Washington is going to stay in Peekskill near the fort on the way north to meet the French. This is when he hatches part of his first plot. On his trip north, let's capture the American commander. Things are not acted upon. The plan never materializes. On the return trip, there's another opportunity. Washington had been up there. He's coming back from meeting the French. And Washington no doubt wants to meet with Arnold, talk to him and get information about what's happening. And he sends word to Arnold that they will dine together. He's going to get in late the night before. The house that Arnold uses as his headquarters is actually across the river from the actual fort. You can see it right here, in this map. So here's the fort itself, and the headquarters would be, again, a very quick boat ride to get across the Hudson. So Washington thinks we'll have breakfast the next morning, and Arnold gives indication that is exactly what's going to happen. When Washington arrives, Arnold is nowhere to be seen. The mystery, of course, clears up later that day. So he rows back across the Hudson, does Washington, to the fort side, and fears the worst. Had he been captured? What's going on? Where's Arnold? His officers don't know inside the fort. In the afternoon, he rows back to Arnold's headquarters. Once again, this is an awkward position to put the commander of the Continental Army in, going back and forth looking for this guy. Papers are then found on a British officer who's dressed as a civilian named John Andre. Here he is.
I'm sorry, but do you think he still would have done this if he realized even like so many years later, his name is synonymous with being a traitor or just crossing someone?
Probably. Because what Arnold believed would happen after, even if he couldn't have captured Washington, even if he couldn't deliver West Point, was that he would be given, because his reputation is high in the British Army, he would be given a command in the British Army, which he was in Virginia at the very end of the war, hadn't been as successful. And that would have put him in good with the British Army and put him in to have a possible career after that. The problem is the British never really trusted him, to have an important, significant command, because his own sympathies were still in doubt, even after he took the money.
If you're willing to betray your own people, then what are you willing to do to the
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you would sell out the Patriot cause, if you could be bribed again for a little bit more money, would you sell out the British cause as well? Yeah. Could they ever trust the guy? Could they ever establish that? Sure. I mean, the definition of a crooked politician, right, is one who's bought and stays bought, or an honest politician, I should say, is someone you can buy and then you keep giving them money and they stay bought. So going back to the story of West Point, Washington searching for him, he's now back on the side of the river where Arnold has his headquarters, and back to Andre. Andre is a civilian, so we know what happens if you are an officer in civilian clothes. You're a spy. Exactly. So they search him, and in his boot, they find that there is information which basically completely involves Benedict Arnold. And the militia who capture Andre don't even know the significance of this until they pass it on to George Washington. And now he says, oh no. I don't know if he suspected this might be happening, but the letters certainly confirm it. To Washington, everything is clear now. Andre was the go-between between Arnold and the British High Command. Washington hurries upstairs. This is awkward, but he does it. He basically jumps into the Arnold's bedchamber where Mrs. Arnold is there, Peggy Shippen Arnold. She's there. hair disheveled, eyes red. She puts on what can only be described as an Oscar-worthy performance, just blathering about Washington's like, where is General Arnold? And she's just speaking in tongues, apparently, because she's not answering the questions. He's unclear of what she's saying. And he's in here like, okay, I don't know what's going on. And she knows. She absolutely knows. But so he says, all right, fine. Clearly, I'm convinced. I wanted to get some information out of you. She's quite incoherent, though. And Washington then says afterwards, Arnold has betrayed me. Whom can we trust now? And Arnold's also made his getaway.
Wait, so he left his wife behind?
Yep. Yeah, nice guy.
Yeah, great guy there.
The nation is stunned by Arnold's treason. It's close to a new low point for Washington. He is furious. He tries to exchange Andre or another high-ranking British officer for Benedict Arnold, and the British don't bite. They also, Washington, hatches a scheme to assassinate Benedict Arnold. I want him dead. I mean, this is the worst thing to Washington. I mean, this guy did this. He can't believe it. And that plot fails as well. So instead, they hang John Andre later in 1780. Meanwhile, after Arnold's treason, there was an overall feeling that the upcoming campaign and the season of 1781 had to be the last of the war. Each year had opened badly, like a bad refrain. The American cause was hurting every January, and none seemed to be worse than January of 1781. The military setbacks had gone on for 8 months. The economy was bankrupt and in a shambles. There were warnings from John Adams, who was in Europe, telling members of Congress, hey, everybody, France is in it for one more year. France is having financial difficulties backing the American rebellion. And then on top of that, Arnold's treason. So, start with January 1781. Next time, we'll talk about the campaign in the South. When Greene arrives, things look bad, but he completely turns the war around in that area.